Ladies and gentlemen, meet David Sedaris.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back on the radio. This is an essay called The Silent Treatment, and it makes a reference to a house that I bought on the coast of North Carolina in 2013. And the houses there are all made out of wood, and they're all on stilts, and they all have names. But they're pun names, like Clam-A-Lot and Dune Our Thing, and one called You Didn't Get This, Bitch. And our house had a dumb name, and so we changed it to the C-section. So this essay is called The Silent Treatment. Aside from an occasional dinner party thrown by one of his neighbors, the only thing my father gets dressed up for anymore is church. When I was young, he'd drop my sisters and me off in time for Sunday school, then head to the club to play golf, and return at the end of the service, most often after everyone else had left. And it was just us, standing alone in front of the shuttered building. Now, though, he's there every week. In a suit? I asked. Well, of course, he said. What do you think? It was late May, and he was sitting on the deck at the C-section, looking out at the ocean, which was relatively calm that day and topaz-colored. Amy and Lisa were at the table, too. Hugh had made us BLTs, and as he set them before us, my father rubbed his hands together. Fantastic! Even in his old age, he's a good-looking man, skin still fairly taut, with an enviable, easy-to-draw nose, all straight line with no bumps. I'd love to have inherited it, but instead I resemble my mother. Nostrils big enough to stuff olives into. Why do you want to know what I wear to church? He asked. I brought up a barbecue restaurant Hugh, Amy, and I had stopped at a few days earlier on our way from Raleigh to Emerald Isle. It was noon on Sunday in a small eastern North Carolina town. I figured that most everyone had come from church and found it interesting that the only men in jackets and ties were Mexican. The rest of them had dockers on and polo shirts, I said. Women wore slacks as well. And? My father asked. It's just something I noticed, that's all. When we were young, we had to get dressed up. Now I hear that people are wearing shorts to church and even sweatpants. My father winced. Well, not at the Holy Trinity. Before our church moved in the 1980s, it was in a stone building situated in downtown Raleigh. The neighborhood was thought of as rough, at least by suburbanites like us. And though nothing bad ever happened, occasionally something exciting did. Say, Dad, remember the time you had a meeting with the priest and I went with you? Lisa asked. We were on our way back home when a black man exposed himself to us. I think I was 12 or 13, and he just pulled his penis right out of his pants and started waving it around. Oh, right. Our father wiped his mouth. I remember that like it was yesterday. Then you made a U-turn so we could see it again. He chuckled. It was big. Most fathers would shield their daughters from something like that, Lisa said. But there you were, making sure I got a second look. Again, he laughed. I guess I saw it as an educational experience. I like it when Lisa and Hugh are around, as they can always get my father to talk. When it's just the two of us, I never know what to say. This is hardly a new development. It's been like this for as long as I can remember. All his life, my father has been handy. He worked on his own cars and once built an addition onto our house in Raleigh. My job always was to hand him tools as he called for them and to hold the work light, a bare bulb in an aluminum cage. It might have been different had I cared what a piston was, or were I interested in the proper consistency of cement. As it was, I never asked, and he never offered. Rather, I just stand there, my arm outstretched like a lawn jockey's. God damn it, quit moving! I'm not. Well, you sure as hell are, so stop it. I suppose I could have asked him questions about his job or his childhood, but it already seemed too late to get into it. Those were the sorts of conversations that should have begun years earlier. They needed foundations built brick by brick, and not just thwacked down whole. He could have asked about my life, but I don't know how articulate I would have been. What were you thinking slapping that beef roast with your bare hands? I don't know. I wasn't being cagey. I honestly hadn't a clue why I'd done it. The roast was on a serving tray, puddled in its own juices that, when I hit it, spattered all over the pastel family portrait we'd sat for earlier that week at the mall. I watched the blood drip down our faces. And then I slapped the roast again, wondering all the while what had come over me. It was the same when I took an industrial stapler to our kitchen countertops, an out-of-body experience. What do other fathers and sons talk about, I'd ask myself, shifting the work light from one hand to the other. There was never any problem making conversation with my mother. That was effortless. The topics springing from nowhere, and we'd move from one to the next in a way that made me think of a monkey gracefully swinging through the branches of a tree. The silence my father and I inflicted on each other back then is now exacerbated by his advanced age. Every time I see him could be the last, and the pressure I feel to make our conversation meaningful paralyzes me. How do you talk to him so easily? I asked Lisa as we carried the lunch dishes back into the house. It's simple, she told me. Sometimes I'll just call and say, "Hey, Dad, what are you up to?" Watching Fox News while doing his taxes, no matter what month it is or what time of day, I said. Yes, well, maybe he found a new deduction. Maybe someone from church died or one of his old neighbors. You never know. That night we went to a restaurant Lisa and her husband Bob are fond of in the town of Atlantic Beach. I put on a shirt and tie. Amy debuted a new dress, and my father wore a T-shirt with white tennis shorts. His legs used to be hairy, but now they're as smooth as a child's. The result, he says, of wearing knee-high socks for all those years at IBM. He rode to the restaurant with Hugh and me and perked up when, halfway through the 20-minute drive, we passed the condominium complex we often stayed at in the 1980s. "Hey," he said, "that's where we used to go when we were a family." "Well, aren't you still a family?" Hugh asked. "I meant when Sharon was alive." Though I hated hearing him say that, I couldn't deny the truth of it. Our mother was the one who held us all together. After her death, we were like a fistful of damp soil, loose bits breaking off with no one to press them back in. When she was around, we came to the beach every year. The place we had just passed was set in a complex of 20 or so units arranged around a pool. There were pictures of us all standing on the deck, my eyes and those of several of my sisters bloodshot from all our pot smoking. I think of the meth-fueled sandcastles we built and the dinosaurs made of driftwood the year we could afford cocaine. "You're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed," our mother used to say when we'd returned from our midnight walks on the beach. She knew what was up. Well, I don't think our father had a clue. The restaurant in Atlantic Beach resembled a shack, so I was surprised by the fancy menu, which was handed out by a young, bow-lipped woman with a sweet Eastern North Carolina accent. "I'd like to start with the women, if that's okay," she said when it came time to take our orders. She turned to Lisa. "So what will you be having this evening, my lady?" It was such an unexpected word, so refined, and Amy repeated it all night. "How were your 5 double scotches, my lady?" When our food arrived, I mentioned a flight attendant I'd recently met. I was asking her about the things passengers leave behind on planes, and she told me that earlier that week she discovered a used body form in one of the seat backs. "Oh, my God," Amy said, delighted. "And it was still warm." My father looked down at his flounder. "Is that any way to talk at the table?" "He's disgusting," Hugh said, happy to have found something he and my father could agree on. I then brought up a fellow I'd met in New Mexico who has an uncle named Phil McCracken. with that? My father asked. Fill my crack in, Lisa said. Get it like butt crack? My father sighed. The level of discourse here is definitely lacking. So tell me, Lou, Hugh said, what was your father like? He was trying to open things up a bit and didn't realize that subject-wise he'd steered us onto a dead-end street. My grandfather, the man we addressed as Papu, died when I was 6 years old. He came from Greece, as did Yaya, my grandmother. Neither of them spoke more than 100 words of English, yet they owned and ran a newsstand in Cortland, New York. The space was long and dim and narrow, like a hallway that led to nothing, lit by a bare bulb. They lived in the small apartment upstairs, and though I can picture it clearly, all I remember about Papu is that he was short, 5'1", according to his immigration papers. Why are you asking about my father? My father said. Hugh shrugged. I just never heard that much about him. My father signaled the waitress for another vodka tonic. Well, he was a very hard worker. You're not going to get any more than that out of him, Lisa said to Hugh. Believe me, we've been trying all our lives. I never told my father, but a few years earlier, I'd received a letter from an 82-year-old woman in Cortland. She said some nice things about my books, then added, your grandfather was a pig. Then it was just her name, no best wishes or anything. I have nothing more to tell you, my father said when Hugh asked for details. The man worked very hard. Both my parents did. There wasn't time for anything else. It's maddening how tight-lipped he is on the subject. Greeks tend to disapprove when their children marry outside the culture, so Papu was a real dick to my mother. She'd shudder at the mention of his name, but never got specific, saying only, you'll have to take that up with your father. How can you not have a single memory of him? I asked later that night on our way home from the restaurant. I mean, there has to be something you recall. Did he drive a car? Did he ever listen to music or read? I remember Yaya saying some pretty rough things about black people, which is odd given her limited vocabulary. It's like she took English lessons from a Klan member, but quit after the second day. Was he that way too? Did he smoke? Did he give you Christmas presents? He's asleep, Hugh told me. What? Your dad. He's asleep. The next morning I saw my father at the dining room table, leafing through a magazine Bob had brought. It was about North Carolina crafts and had a salad bowl on the cover. Hey, he cried, looking up as I came down the stairs. There he is. Lisa entered at around the same time, saying, how you doing, Dad? Fantastic. It's my habit to write in the morning, so I made a pot of coffee and carried it up to the room that Hugh and I share. My work table is in a corner, beside a sliding glass door that looks out onto the ocean, and I'd been sitting at it for an hour or so when my father wandered in. This is something he's done since I was a child. I'd be at my desk drawing or doing homework, and he'd just come in and stretch out on the bed. What's going on? He'd ask. A minute later, he'd be fast asleep. This continued after I moved out and had my own apartment on the other side of Raleigh. He'd walk in without knocking and go straight to my bed, almost urgently, as if it were a toilet he desperately needed to use. So what's going on? My father asked, hands on his hips, looking out my sliding glass door at the ocean. Nothing, I said, just trying to get some work done. He sat on the edge of the bed and tested it, the way you might if you were shopping for a new mattress. I noticed that his feet barely touched the floor, and as he lifted them in order to stretch out, I turned back to my computer and finished a letter I was writing to a convict. I get a lot of mail from people in prison, both men and women. They rarely say what they're in for, but what with the internet, it's easy enough to find out. Drugs, in this case. So how you doing? My father asked. How's your health? This was possibly the 10th time in 2 days that he'd asked me this question. Fine. You feeling pretty good? I guess. I can see him doing the same thing I am, trying to make some sort of connection. We're like a pair of bad trapeze artists, reaching for each other's hands and missing every time. Meanwhile, the stage crew has gathered below us and begun to roll up the safety net. "Thank you for dinner last night," my father said. "That was awfully generous of you." It was my pleasure. I returned my attention to the letter I was writing and wondered who might be the first to read it. By the time I turned back to my father, he was snoring, which was for the best, probably. Growing up, I never got the sense that he particularly liked me. I didn't feel completely unloved. If the house were on fire, he would have dragged me out, though it would have been after he rescued everyone else, including the cat and dog. It could have been worse. At least I had my mother. But as a child, it really bothered me. What can I do to make him like me, I used to wonder. The harder I tried to mold myself into the sort of son I thought he wanted, the more contemptuous he became. And so eventually I quit trying and founded the opposition party, which I still lead to this day. Whatever he's for, I'm against. Almost. Watching my father asleep on the bed, I thought again of the pastel family portrait I'd ruined. If that were an isolated incident, I might have a right to my self-pity. But if I'm honest about it, I wouldn't have liked my childhood self either. I regularly lied and stole money from him. If there was silence in the car, I'd break it by making one of my sisters cry. "Dad, David keeps saying I'm pregnant and that the baby will have a cat's body and be born dead." I never did too, did not, liar. For a while, when I was 11 or so, I used to drop the empty cardboard toilet rolls into the John. They would take a while to disappear, 5 or 6 flushes usually, but I was in no hurry. The first 3 times the toilet clogged, my father went at it with the plunger, and that did the trick. Then, for some reason, the plunger wasn't enough. He ordered me to get his toolbox and to stand in the open doorway, ready to hand him whatever he called for. After draining the tank and turning off the water supply, he used his wrench on the lug nuts and unmoored the toilet from the floor, exposing a foul, corroded, fist-sized hole that stunk up the entire house. I held my breath and watched as he reached down into it and withdrew part of the roll I had flushed a few hours earlier. Who in the hell? That night there was a big lecture at the dinner table. When I get my hands on whoever's doing this, he didn't even use a glove, I thought. Watching as he took a piece of bread from the wicker basket we had. A few nights later, I flushed another empty roll down the John, which clogged again. Out came the plunger, the tools, orders to stand in the doorway. The toilet was lifted off the floor, and as my father cursed and rolled up his sleeves, I must have laughed, or at least smiled in some telltale way. "You," he growled, looking up at me from his kneeling position on the floor. "You're the one who's doing this." "Me? Don't even try to talk your way out of it." I offered some lame denial. "I hardly ever even go to the bathroom." "You should ask Amy or Tiffany. They're the ones." "You are going to reach down this pipe and pick out that cardboard roll," my father said. "Then you are never going to flush anything but toilet paper down this toilet again." As I backed away, he pounced. Then he wrestled me to the floor, grabbed my hand, and forced it deep into what amounted to my family's ass. And there it has been ever since, sorting through our various crap. It's like I froze in that moment, with the same interests as that 11-year-old boy, the same maturity level, the same haircut, same glasses even. What I remember more vividly than the stench and the sight of my hand when I pulled it out of that terrible pipe was how strong my father was. I'd put up the fight of my life, but might as well have been a doll, the way he wrenched apart my folded arms and took me by the wrist. I couldn't imagine being that powerful. He's slighter now, of course, shorter by a few inches and downright skinny, arms and legs no thicker than the bones beneath them. How was I ever afraid of this person, I wondered, watching his narrow chest as it rose and fell. "David!" he used to shout from the top of the stairs. "Get up here!" "What did I do?" I'd call from my room, certain he'd found me out for something. "Whatever it wasn't me. Get up here now." Half the time it would be trouble. He'd discovered the branches torn off the tree he'd just planted, or the football he gave me melted on the hibachi. But just as likely, he'd be in the living room and music would be playing. It was always jazz, most often something on the radio. My father's most prized possession was his stereo system, which he housed in a glass-doored cabinet, turntable, amplifier, fancy tape deck, all of it top of the line and off limits to the rest of us. "Sit down," he'd say, gesturing to the couch. "I want you to listen to this. I mean really listen." "Who is it?" I'd ask. "Never mind that now. Just listen." He tried doing the same to my sisters and my brother Paul, but none of them ever heard what he and I did. John Coltrane's I Wish I Knew. Betty Carter singing Beware My Heart. The hairs on my arms would stand up, and everything else would recede. My shitty life at school, the loneliness and self-loathing I worried every day might drag me under. All of it replaced by unspeakable beauty. "Are you getting this?" he'd ask, his hands balled into fists, the way a coach's might be, pacing the room as I listened. Afterwards, spent, he'd turn down the volume, and we'd share that rare silence that was companionable rather than tense. This was what we had in common. Music. When he was growing up, jazz was the equivalent of rap or punk rock. Listening to it meant something. It made you a certain kind of person, especially to parents whose best-loved instrument was a bouzouki. I don't imagine Papu could have distinguished Miles Davis from a passing dump truck. It was all just noise to him. That might have been part of its appeal to my father, but it had nothing to do with mine. Music was the only way I didn't rebel against him. Sitting in the silent afterglow of a song he'd just ordered me to listen to, I'd imagine myself on stage, sweat-drenched at the piano like Oscar Peterson, or perhaps I was a headlining trumpet player or guitarist taking a bow. The audience before me would be going wild with appreciation, though one person in particular would stand out, my father, on his feet, cheering. "Did you hear that? That's my son up there." There was a baby grand piano just outside the bedroom I occupied until I left for college, and I'd strike the keys from time to time, imagining how proud I could make him by buckling down and really learning how to play. By the age of 12, though, I knew a setup when I saw one. There's an expression you often hear from recovering alcoholics: don't go to the hardware store for milk. If I were to master an instrument or do anything creative with my life, I'd have to do it for myself and myself only. As an adult, I regularly returned to Raleigh and read out loud at what used to be Memorial Auditorium, but is now part of the Duke Energy Center. My family will attend, and afterwards, without fail, my father will say, "That was nice and everything, but it wasn't sold out." Well, actually it was, I'll tell him. "No, it wasn't," he'll say. "While waiting for you to walk on stage, I counted 30 empty seats." This is him all over. The place accommodates more than 2,200 people, but all he can see are the unoccupied chairs. As a rule, 5% of concert goers who buy their tickets 6 months or more in advance either forget to show up or make other plans in the meantime, I'll tell him, quoting my friend Adam, who started producing events 30 years ago and knows what he's talking about. "That's not true," my father will say. "Those seats weren't forgotten. They were empty." This as if a marked disinterest in me had turned them a different color. "Okay," I'll say, thinking, who does this? Goes to the shows of people they're supposed to be proud of and counts the empty seats. Were I playing the piano to a packed house at the Monterey Jazz Festival, it would be no different. "Where the hell was everyone?" he'd ask when my set was over. He takes a lot of naps now, my father. 2 or 3 a day by my count, at least when we're all together at the beach. In 20 or so minutes, he'd wake up, recharged. And though I wanted to join the action downstairs, I didn't want him to wake up in an empty room. There was nothing to do but wait, I supposed. And in the meantime, I'd put together a playlist we could listen to. A little Jessica Williams, followed by Sam Jones and Eddie Higgins. People he might not have heard lately. A bill guaranteed to really shut us up for a while. I was going to read a few things from my diary here. July 26, 2015, London. I was in my office early yesterday evening, and when someone knocked, I stuck my head out the window. Yes, it was the Frenchman who lives up the street. I think you have left your keys in the door, he said, and so I had. Boy, was I grateful. Still, I so very much wanted to shout, "What are you doing looking at my door?" July 1st, 2017, Raleigh. My favorite person at last night's book signing was a 50-year-old man who lives with his mother. "What do you do for a living?" I asked. "Well," he said, "I'm mentally ill. And that keeps me pretty busy." May 14th, 2017, Anchorage. I met a male nurse at last night's signing. "I thought of you not long ago," he told me. "I was putting a catheter in a patient. A woman in a coma when she started to pee. That's common enough," he continued, "but then she farted. The force blew through the urine, and a drop of it flew into the air and went right into my open mouth." "Oh, my God," I said. "My hands were full, so there was nothing I could do," he told me. Anyway, made me think of you.
Meet David Sedaris was written and presented by David Sedaris. The producer was Steve Doherty, and it was a Giddy Goat production for BBC Radio 4. Ladies and gentlemen, meet David Sedaris.
Thank you so much. This is an essay I had in the New Yorker last year, and it was in my book, Calypso, and it's called "Why Aren't You Laughing?" From the outside, our house on the North Carolina coast, the C-section, is nothing much to look at. It might have been designed by a 10-year-old with a ruler. That's how basic it is. Walls, roof, windows, deck. Whenever I denigrate the place, Hugh reminds me that it's the view that counts, the ocean we look out at. I see his point, but it's not like you have to limit yourself to one or the other. What about West Sussex, I say? From the outside, our cottage in England resembles something you'd find in a storybook, a home for pot-bellied trolls. Built of stone in the late 16th century, it has a pitched roof and little windows with panes the size of playing cards. We lie in bed and consider sheep grazing in the shadow of a verdant down. I especially love being there in winter, so it bothered me when I had to spend most of January and February working in the United States. Hugh came along, and toward the end we found ourselves on Maui, where I had a reading. I'd have been happy just to fly in and fly out, but Hugh likes to swim in the ocean, so we stayed for a week in a place he found online. "Let me guess," the box office manager of the theater I performed at said. "It's spread out over at least 4 levels and paneled in dark wood like something you'd see on a 1970s TV show, right?" He'd hit it squarely on the nose, especially the dark part. The wood on the interior walls had been rigorously stained and was almost the color of fudge, a stark contrast to the world outside, which was relentlessly, almost oppressively bright. As for the various levels, Any excuse seemed to have been taken to add stairs, even if only 2 or 3. If you lived there full time, you'd no doubt get the hang of them. As it was, I tripped or fell down at least twice a day. The house reminded me of the condominium units my family used to rent on Emerald Isle when I was in my 20s, though none of those had a crucifix hanging in the kitchen. This one was 10 inches tall and supported a slender, miserable Christ, plated in bronze. That was the only decoration, aside from a number of framed photo collages of the owner and his family taken over the years. They were a good-looking group, one that multiplied as the children grew and had kids of their own. The color in the earlier snapshots had faded, just as it has in pictures of my own family. Same haircuts, same flared slacks and shirts with long, droopy collars, only now drained of their vibrancy, like lawns in winter. Each generation looked healthy and prosperous, yet I found myself wondering what lurked beneath the surface, for surely there was something. Which of you is in prison now? I'd ask, glancing up as I tripped on the stairs to the bedroom. The house was on the ocean, and the beach that began where the backyard ended was shaded with palms. Most often it was deserted, so except for a few short trips up the coast for supplies, Hugh stayed put during our week on Maui. If he wasn't on the deck overlooking the water, he was in the water looking back at the deck. He saw whales and sea turtles. He snorkeled. My only accomplishment was to sign my name to 5,000 blank sheets of paper sent by my publisher. Tip-ins, they're called. A month or 2 down the line, they'd be bound into copies of the book I had just about finished. There were still a few more weeks to make changes, but they could only be minor grammatical things. Hugh, who was good at spotting typos and used to do so for his father, a novelist, was reading the manuscript for the first time. Whenever I heard him laugh, I'd ask, "What's so funny?" Should 5 or 10 minutes pass with no reaction, I'd call out, "Why aren't you laughing?" It takes quite a while to sign your name 5,000 times, so I set myself a daily goal and would stop whatever I was doing every 2 hours and pick up my magic marker. Often while autographing, I'd listen to the radio or watch a TV show I liked called Intervention. In it, real-life alcoholics and drug addicts are seen going about their business. Most are too far gone to hold down jobs, so mainly we see them starting fights, crying on unmade beds, and shooting up in hard-to-spot places like the valleys between their toes. Amazing to me is that anyone would allow him or herself to be filmed in this condition. "Did you catch me on TV?" I'd imagine them saying to their friends. "Wasn't it incredible when I shit on that car?" That's what a 31-year-old drunk woman did in one of the episodes I watched as I signed blank sheets of paper, pulled down her pants, positioned herself just so, and defecated on the rear bumper of a parked Audi A4. As she went at it, a diamond shape blurring her from the waist down, I thought of my mother. In part because she was a lady. By this I mean that she never wore trousers, just skirts and dresses. She never left the house without makeup on and her hair styled. Whenever I see a young woman boarding a plane in her pajamas or a guy in a T-shirt that reads, "Your hole is my goal," I always wonder what Mom would think. She's been dead since 1991, so missed a lot of the build-up to what is now thought of as less than scandalous behavior. I once watched a show in which a group of young men were sent out to collect pubic hair. It was a contest of sorts, and in the end, the loser had to put all the spoils on a pizza and eat it. That was in 2003. So to me, someone on television shitting on a car, okay, sure. That makes sense. To go there straight from murder, she wrote, however, would be quite a shock. Another reason Intervention makes me think about my mother is that she was an alcoholic. It's a hard word to use for someone you love, and so my family avoided it. Rather, we'd whisper amongst ourselves that Mom had a problem, that she could stand to cut back. Sober, she was cheerful and charismatic, the kind of person who could and would talk to anyone. Unlike our father, who makes jokes no one understands and leaves his listeners baffled and eager to get away, it was fun to hear what our Mom might come out with. "I got them laughing" was a popular line in the stories she'd tell at the end of the day. The men who pumped her gas, the bank tellers, the receptionists at the dentist's office, I got them laughing. Her specialty was a real-life story, perfected and condensed. These take work, and she'd go through a half-dozen verbal drafts before getting one where she wanted it. Over the course of the day, the line she wished she'd delivered in response to some question or comment, the zinger, would become the line she had delivered. "So I said to him, buddy, that's why they invented the airplane." We'd be on the sidelines aghast. That's not how it happened at all. But what did it matter with such great results? You'd think my mother could have seen the difference between the sunny, likable her and the dark one who'd call late at night. I could hear the ice cubes in her glass rushing forth whenever she took a sip. In my youth, when she joined my father for a drink after work, just one, I have to get dinner on the table, that was a happy sound. Now it was like a trigger being cocked. "The little bitch," my mother would say, her voice slurred, referring to someone she might have spoken to that afternoon or maybe 5 years earlier, a shop clerk, a neighbor, talking to me that way, like that, like I'm nothing. She doesn't know it, but I could buy and sell her. Fly home for a visit, and you'd find her in the kitchen, slamming around, replaying some argument she'd had with our father. "Goddamn bastard, shove it up your ass, why don't you? You and your stinking. Why hire a plumber when I can do it myself? You can't do it yourself. You hear me, buddy? You can't." By that point in the evening, she'd look different, raw, like you'd taken the lady she was earlier and peeled her. The loafers she favored would have been kicked off, and she'd be in her stocking feet, hands on the counter to steady herself as she raged. She was hardly ever angry at the person she was talking to, exceptions being my brother Paul, my father, and my sister Tiffany. Rather, she'd be looking for support. "Can you believe this crap? I mean, can you?" We didn't dare contradict her. I have an English friend named Ingrid, and her father was an alcoholic. When he lost his license for driving drunk, he got himself a tricycle and would pedal it back and forth to a pub, everyone in the village watching. "Not a regular bike?" I asked. "He would have fallen off," Ingrid told me. Relieved to be at the stage where she could laugh about it. Her father was a horrible person, a mean clown, which makes it easier in a way. Our mother did nothing so cartoonish, and if she had, we'd have felt traitorous making fun of her. Instead, we separated her into two people and discounted what the second drunk one did. For that wasn't really her, we reasoned, but a kind of virus talking. The big moment on intervention is when family and friends of the alcoholic or drug addict confront him or her. It's supervised by a counselor and often takes place in a sad hotel conference room with flesh-colored furniture and no windows. The addicts are usually in full blossom, drunk or high or on the nod. "What the hell?" they say, looking around at their parents, their brothers and sisters, their wives or husband, all together, seated in a semicircle. The subjects of the intervention already feel ambushed, so steps are taken to keep them from feeling attacked as well. It's easy to lose one's temper in this situation, so the counselor has instructed the friends and family members to organize their thoughts on paper. The letters they read are never wholly negative and usually kick off with a pleasant memory. "I remember when you were brought home from the hospital," is a big one. This is the equivalent of a short story beginning with the main character's alarm clock going off. And though I know I shouldn't get hung up on this part of the show, I do. "Oh, please," I think, rolling my eyes as a combative meth addict is told, "You had a smile that could light up a room." The authors of the letters often cry, perhaps because what they've written is so poorly constructed. Then again, reality TV is fueled by tears. Take another of the shows I like, My 600-Pound Life, about morbidly obese people struggling with their weight. At the start of each program, loved ones appear, always weeping, always saying the exact same thing. I don't want to have to bury my own child, /sister, /nephew, etc. Yes, well, I wouldn't either, I think. If digging the grave didn't do me in, I surely died trying to roll that massive body into it. After everyone on intervention has had their say, the addicts are offered a spot in a rehab center. Not all of them accept, but most do. The places they're sent to tend to be sunny: Arizona, Southern California, Florida. We see them 2 months into their stay, most looking like completely different people. Here are the wind chimes I made in my arts and crafts group. The woman who earlier in the program was seen shooting speed into her neck says. Not everyone stays the prescribed 90 days. Some leave early and relapse. Others get out on schedule and relapse a week or 6 months later. The hardiest of them are revisited several years down the line, still sober, many with jobs now and children. All that time I wasted, they say. What on earth was I thinking? I asked Ingrid once if she ever talked to her father about his drinking, and I think she was ashamed to answer no. Not that I or anyone in my family ever confronted my mother, no matter how bad it got. Even my dad, who's super direct and tells complete strangers that they're loud or wrong or too fat for that bolero jacket, said nothing. Then again, it built so gradually. For as long as I was living at home, it never seemed a problem. It was only after 5 of her 6 children had left that she upped her quota. The single scotch before dinner became 2, then 3. Her wine intake doubled, tripled. She was never a quality drinker. Quantity was what mattered. She bought jugs, not bottles. After dinner, she'd switch to coffee and then back to scotch or wine, supplementing the alcohol with pills. Mom's dolls, we called them. When she told us that she would no longer drive at night, that she couldn't see the road, we all went along with it, knowing the real reason was that by sunset she was in no shape to get behind the wheel. Gosh, we said, we hope that doesn't happen to our eyes when we're your age. In that respect, you have to hand it to the family members on intervention. Corny letters notwithstanding, they have guts. The person they're confronting might storm out of the room and never talk to them again, but at least they're rolling the dice. Though we never called our mother on her behavior, she knew that we noticed it. I haven't had a drink in 4 days, she'd announce out of nowhere, usually over the phone. You could hear the struggle and the hope in her voice. I'd call her the next night and could tell right away that she'd lost her willpower. Why aren't you stronger? I wanted to ask. I mean, really, can't you just try harder? Of course, I was drunk too, so what could I say? I suppose I felt that my youth made it less sad. The vast plain of adulthood stretched before me while she was well into her 50s, drinking alone in a house filled with crap. Even sober, she'd rail against that, all the junk my father dragged home and left in the yard or the basement, old newspapers and magazines, toaster ovens picked out of the trash, hoses, sheets of plywood, all of it perfectly good, all of it just what he needed. In my mind, our house used to be so merry. There was music playing in every room. The phone was always ringing. People in my family laughed more than people in other families. I was as sure of that as I was of anything. Up and down the street, our neighbors left their dinner tables as soon as they could and beat it for the nearest TV. That's what my father did, while the rest of us stayed put with our mother, vying for her attention as the candles burned down. Group therapy, she called it, though it was more like a master class. One of us would tell a story about our day, and she'd interject every now and then to give notes. You don't need all that detail about the bedroom, she'd say, or maybe it's best to skip the part about the teacher and just cut to the chase. Pour me a cup of coffee, she'd say, come 10 o'clock, our empty plate still in front of us. Get me another pack of Winstons from the pantry, will you? One of the perks of having 6 kids was that you didn't have to locate anything on your own. Find my car keys, she'd command, or someone get me a pair of shoes. There was never a rebellion because it was her asking. Pleasing our mother was fun and easy and made us feel good. I'll light her cigarette. No, I will. Maybe ours wasn't the house I'd have chosen had I been in charge of things. It wasn't as clean as I would have liked. From the outside, it wasn't remarkable. We had no view. But still, it was the place I held in mind, and proudly, when I thought home. It had been a living organism, but by the time I hit my late 20s, it was rotting, a dead tooth in a row of seemingly healthy ones. When I was 11, my father planted a line of olive bushes in front of the house. They were waist high and formed a kind of fence. By the mid-'80s, they were so overgrown that pedestrians had to quit the sidewalk and take to the streets instead. People with trash to drop waited until they reached our yard to drop it, figuring the high grass would cover whatever they needed to discard. It was like the Addams family's house, which would have been fine had it still been Mary, but it wasn't anymore. Our mother became the living ghost that haunted it, gaunt now, and rattling ice cubes instead of chains. I'd come home from Chicago, where I was living, and she would offer to throw a dinner party for my friends. Invite the Sieglers, she'd say, and, hey, Dean or Lynn, I haven't seen her in a while. She was lonely for company, so I'd pick up the phone. By the time my guests arrived, she'd be wasted. My friends all noticed it. How could they not? Sitting at the table as she repeated a story for the 3rd time, I got them laughing. Watching as she stumbled, as the ash of her cigarette fell onto the floor, I'd cringe and then feel guilty for being embarrassed by her. The morning after a dinner party, her makeup applied but still in her robe, my mother would be sheepish. Well, it was nice to see Dean again. That would have been the perfect time to sit her down, to say, do you remember how out of control you were last night? What can we do to help you? I'm forever thinking of all our missed opportunities. 6 kids and a husband, and not a one of us spoke up. I imagine her at a rehab center in Arizona or California, a state she'd never been to. Who knew I'd be so good at pottery? I can hear her saying, and I'm really looking forward to rebuilding my life. Sobriety would not have stopped the cancer that was quietly growing inside her, but it would have allowed her to hold her head up, to recall what it felt like to live without shame, if only for a few years. Do you think it was my fault that she drank? My father asked not long ago. It's the assumption of an amateur, someone who stops after his 2nd vodka tonic and quits taking his pain medication before the prescription runs out. It's almost laughable, this insistence on a reason. I think my mother was lonely without her children, her fan club. But I think she drank because she was an alcoholic. How can you watch that crap? He would say whenever he walked into the house on Maui and caught me in front of intervention. Well, I'm not only watching it, I'd tell him. I'm also signing my name. This was never enough for him. You're in Hawaii, sitting indoors in the middle of the day. Get out of here, why don't you? Go get some sun. And so I'd put on my shoes and take a walk, never on the beach, but along the road or through residential neighborhoods. One afternoon, I pushed an SUV that had stalled in traffic. The driver was perhaps in his mid-20s and was talking on the phone when I offered a hand. He nodded. So I took up my position at the rear and remembered, after the first few yards, what a complete pain in the ass it is to help someone in need. I thought he'd just steer to the curb, but instead he went another 100 or so feet down the road, where he turned the corner. Does he expect me to push him all the Way home? I asked myself, panting. Eventually he pulled over and put on the brake. The guy never thanked me or even put down his phone. Horse's ass, I thought. Back at the house, I took another stack of papers and started signing my name to them. That's not your signature, Hugh said, frowning over my shoulder. It's what became of my signature, I told him, looking at the scrawl in front of me. You could sort of make out a D and an S, but the rest was like the silhouette of a mountain range or a hospital patient's medical chart just before he's given the bad news. In my defense, it never occurred to me that I'd be signing my name 5,000 times. In the course of my entire life, maybe, but not in one shot. This was not the adulthood that I had predicted for myself. An author of books, spending a week in Hawaii with his handsome, long-time boyfriend before deciding which house to return to. I'd wished for it, sure, but I'd also wished for a complete head transplant. Hugh had made himself a Manhattan and was sitting on the patio with my manuscript. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. "Why aren't you laughing?" I called. I was living in New York, still broke and unpublished, when my mother, only 62 years old, died. Aside from the occasional Sidney Sheldon novel, she wasn't a reader, so didn't understand the world I was fluttering around the edges of. If she thought it was hopeless, or that I was wasting my time writing, she never said as much. My father, on the other hand, was more than happy to predict the dismal future. Perhaps it was despite him that she supported us in our far-fetched endeavors. Art school for me and Gretchen, Amy at Second City. Just when we needed money, at the moment before we had to ask for it, checks would arrive. A little something to see you through, the accompanying notes would read. Love, your old mother. Was she sober in those moments, I wondered, signing my name to another sheet of paper? Was it with a clear mind that she believed in us, or was it just the booze talking? The times I miss her most are when I see something she might have liked, a piece of jewelry or a painting, the view of a white sand beach off a balcony, palm trees. How I'd have loved to spoil her with beautiful things. On one of her last birthdays, I gave her a wasp's nest that I'd found in the woods. It was all I could afford, a nursery that bugs made and left behind. I'll get you something better later, I promised. Of course you will, she said, reaching for her glass. And whatever it is, I'm sure I'm going to love it. Oh, look, we have some extra time here. If anybody has any questions, you could raise your hand. I went and saw Susan Sontag speak one time. And she said, does anybody have a question? And someone raised her hand and asked. And she said, that's the stupidest question I ever heard in my life. She said, next question. And of course, no one put their hand up.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the show. And I've been to see you in lots of different places. I've just finished reading Calypso. And I love the insight you give us into your family. And I hope this isn't too rude to ask, but how is your father these days?
How is my father these days? Well, about 3 weeks ago, I got a call that he was dying. And he was in the hospital, and they were pumping great quantities of ale-colored bile from his lungs. And so I bought last-minute tickets for myself and Hugh. And so, of course, by the time I got there, he was out of the hospital. Like I said, I figured you would rally once I spent all that money on tickets. He's indestructible. He's going to be 96 next week. And he just refuses to die. But actually, he had a stroke a year ago because he was going to the gym 5 days a week and driving, and then he had a little stroke, and then he fell, And then it's kind of been one thing after another. So when I saw him a few weeks ago, he could no longer walk, and he was in a chair, and it's very hard for him to speak. And he said, "I'm a zombie." And I said, "No, zombies can walk and eat solid food. You're more like a vegetable." You get the children you deserve. So thank you for coming.
Meet David Sedaris was written and presented by David Sedaris. The producer was Steve Doherty, and it was a Giddy Goat production for BBC Radio 4.